There is a peculiar cruelty in inheritance, one that has nothing to do with estates or fortunes, or the gleaming treasures passed from one generation to the next, for what children truly inherit from their parents are the wounds, the whispered scandals, the sins that stain a family name long after the sinner himself has turned to dust beneath the cold earth of the churchyard. Lady Eloise Ashworth understood this truth with an intimacy that had shaped every corner of her existence, had carved itself into her very bones during the 22 years she had walked this earth, bearing a name that made drawing rooms fall silent and invitations mysteriously vanish. Her father, the late Earl of Ashworth, had been dead these 15 years, yet his legacy lived on in the averted gazes of former friends, in the cruel cut, direct delivered by matrons who had once bounced her upon their knees, in the genteel poverty that now defined her days in the modest cottage, where she tended to her ailing mother with hands that had once been destined for silk and diamonds. She could not remember the specifics of her father's crimes, for she had been but a child of 7 when the scandal broke, but she knew their shape from the whispers that had followed her through girlhood and into womanhood. Betrayal of the worst sort, the exposure of secrets that had destroyed another noble family entirely, financial machinations that had left the Duke of Blackwood's father ruined and broken, dead by his own hand, within the year, they said, though polite society never spoke of such things directly. What Eloise remembered was the before and the after, the glittering world of her childhood replaced seemingly overnight by shame and exile, her father's death following swiftly as though guilt itself had consumed him, leaving behind only debts and disgrace, and a daughter who would spend the rest of her life paying for sins she had never committed. Now she stood before the small looking-glass in her bedchamber, examining her reflection with the practical eye of a woman who had long ago abandoned vanity for survival, noting the careful mending along the sleeve of her best day dress, the slight fade in the once rich blue muslin that no amount of careful storage could prevent. Her hair, a deep auburn that her mother called her one true beauty, was pinned simply but elegantly, for Eloise had learned that dignity cost nothing and was often the only currency she possessed. The face that gazed back at her was pleasant rather than striking, with intelligent grey eyes that held more wariness than a young woman's ought to hold, and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile without reservation. She was preparing for Lady Pemberton's country house party at Thornfield Manor, an invitation that had arrived unexpectedly, and which Eloise suspected had been extended more from pity than genuine welcome, for Lady Pemberton had been a friend of her mother's in the days before everything crumbled. It was a rare opportunity, perhaps the only one she might receive this year, and though every instinct warned her of the dangers of exposing herself to society's judgment, Eloise knew she could not afford the luxury of pride when her mother's medicine grew more expensive by the month and their small income stretched ever thinner. The name Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Blackwood, was spoken in drawing rooms across England with a particular mixture of reverence and unease, for he was a man who inspired both admiration and fear in equal measure, a figure of such formidable presence that even the most confident of society matrons found themselves choosing their words with unusual care when he deigned to attend their gatherings. He was wealthy beyond the dreams of most men, having rebuilt the Blackwood fortune from the ashes of ruin through investments and ventures that lesser nobles whispered were beneath a duke's dignity, but which had restored his family's coffers to overflowing magnificence. He was powerful, his influence extending through parliament and commerce, and the intricate web of social connections that truly governed English life. Yet he wielded that power with a cold precision that left little room for warmth or sentiment. At 32, he remained unmarried despite being the most sought-after prize of every season for the past decade, his rejection of eager debutantes so consistent and absolute that ambitious mothers had largely ceased their scheming, recognizing in his winter-grey eyes a man who would not be moved by simpering flattery or calculated displays of accomplishment. Those who knew the history understood that the ice which encased the Duke's heart had been forged in the fires of tragedy, for his father had been destroyed utterly by the Earl of Ashworth's treachery, secrets exposed that had brought shame upon the family name, financial schemes revealed that had stripped away the Blackwood wealth, leaving the old Duke broken in spirit and, some whispered in darkened corners, broken enough to take his own life when Sebastian was but 12 years old. His mother had followed within the year, her heart simply failing as grief consumed her from within, and young Sebastian had been left alone to face a world that offered him nothing but creditors and condolences. That he had risen from such devastation to become one of the most formidable men in England was a testament to his iron will. But that same iron had seemingly replaced whatever softer substance might once have composed his soul. It was known throughout society that he despised the Ashworth name, with a passion that time had done nothing to diminish, that he had refused to attend any gathering where members of that disgraced family might appear, that he had once left a ball within minutes of arrival upon learning that a distant Ashworth cousin was among the guests. This was the knowledge that turned Eloise's blood to ice when she received her mother's trembling report that the Duke of Blackwood himself would be attending Lady Pemberton's house party. For a long moment, she considered sending her regrets, fabricating some illness or obligation that would keep her safely away from those cold eyes and the hatred they surely contained for anyone bearing her father's blood. But as she looked around their modest cottage, at the threadbare carpets and the empty spaces where paintings had been sold to pay the apothecary, she knew she could not afford such cowardice, for this gathering might be her only chance to meet some minor gentleman who might overlook her tainted name in favor of her modest accomplishments, and she would simply have to survive whatever contempt the Duke might direct her way. Thornfield Manor rose from the autumn landscape like a jewel set against velvet, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the late afternoon light as the hired carriage that had cost Eloise nearly a month's household budget wound its way up the sweeping drive, and she pressed her gloved hand against the window glass as though she might absorb some of the grandeur through her fingertips, storing it away against the lean days that would surely follow this brief respite from her ordinary existence. The grounds were immaculate, rolling lawns giving way to formal gardens, still blooming with the last roses of the season, and everywhere she looked there were signs of wealth so casual it need not announce itself. The perfectly matched team of horses being led toward the stables, the livered footmen descending the front steps to assist arriving guests, the glitter of jewels at throats and ears as elegantly dressed figures moved past the tall windows of what must be the main drawing room. Eloise smoothed her faded blue muslin with hands that trembled only slightly, reminding herself that she had as much right to be here as anyone, that Lady Pemberton had extended the invitation freely, that she would not shame her mother by cowering like a whipped dog simply because her gown was 3 seasons old and her pearls were paste. The footman who handed her down barely glanced at her modest trunk, and she caught the flicker of assessment in his eyes, the swift cataloguing of her worn travelling cloak and serviceable boots that marked her as a guest of little consequence. But she lifted her chin and walked through the great oak doors as though she belonged among the crystal chandeliers and priceless paintings that adorned the entrance hall. Lady Pemberton greeted her with a warmth that Eloise suspected was partially performance for the benefit of watching guests, but there was genuine kindness in the older woman's eyes as she pressed Eloise's hands and declared how pleased she was that dear Catherine's daughter could join them at last. The drawing-room was a sea of silk and superficial smiles, and Eloise accepted a cup of tea she did not want simply to have something to do with her hands, positioning herself near a window where she might observe without being forced into conversation. When she felt the atmosphere in the room shift like weather changing, a sudden tension that rippled through the assembled guests and drew every eye toward the doorway. He stood there like a dark pillar against the warm, golden light of the hallway beyond, tall and broad-shouldered in impeccably tailored black, his hair the color of a raven's wing and his face carved from stone that had never learned to smile. And Eloise knew him instantly, even though she had never seen him before in her life, knew him from the descriptions whispered behind fans and the reputation that preceded him like a winter frost. The Duke of Blackwood surveyed the room with eyes the color of storm clouds over a frozen lake, and when that gaze swept across the assembled guests, it passed over Eloise, paused, and returned with a sharpening focus that made her breath catch in her throat. She watched recognition dawn in those cold grey depths, watched his expression harden from mere aristocratic hauteur into something far more personal, and in that moment she understood that he knew exactly who she was, knew her father's face in her own features, and that whatever she had hoped to accomplish at this gathering had become infinitely more complicated. Lady Pemberton's seating arrangement at dinner placed them at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, a distance for which Eloise was profoundly grateful as she applied herself to courses she could not taste, and later, as she retreated to her modest chamber, She heard the whispers following her up the stairs like trailing ghosts, voices wondering at her boldness in daring to breathe the same air as the man her father had destroyed. The morning dawned grey and heavy with the promise of rain, and Eloise watched from her chamber window as the other guests assembled on the front lawn in their fine riding habits, their laughter carrying up to where she stood in her simple morning dress, knowing that she possessed neither the proper attire nor the skill to join their excursion across the estate's sprawling grounds. Lady Pemberton had mentioned at breakfast that Thornfield Manor possessed one of the finest private libraries in the county, a collection assembled over 3 generations and containing volumes that scholars had travelled great distances to consult, and Eloise had seized upon this information as a drowning woman might grasp an offered hand, for books had always been her refuge, the one realm where her father's name carried no weight and her worn clothes drew no pitying glances. She made her way through the quiet corridors while the house emptied of its more active inhabitants, finding the library doors standing open as though in invitation, and when she stepped inside she felt her breath catch at the beauty of it. 2 stories of leather-bound volumes rising toward a painted ceiling, a gallery circling the upper level accessible by a spiraling iron staircase, and tall windows that cast pale autumn light across reading tables polished to a mirror shine. Hours slipped past unnoticed as Eloise lost herself among the shelves, pulling down volumes of poetry and philosophy and natural history, creating small towers of treasures on the table she had claimed in a corner alcove, and she was so absorbed in a treatise on the cultivation of roses that she failed to notice how the light through the windows had shifted from pale grey to something far more ominous. The first crack of thunder startled her so violently that she nearly dropped the book, and she rose to press her face against the glass, watching with growing alarm as the sky transformed into a roiling mass of black and green, the trees beyond the formal gardens bending before winds that had risen from nowhere with terrifying speed. She gathered her shawl and hurried toward the main house, but she had lingered too long, wandered too far into the estate's grounds during a brief exploratory walk, and by the time she reached the manicured lawns, the heavens had opened with a violence that stole her breath, rain driving horizontally in sheets that soaked her to the skin within moments. Through the chaos of the storm she glimpsed a structure ahead, a stone building of modest size that must be the old hunting lodge she had heard the gentleman mention, and she ran toward it, with her skirts dragging and her carefully pinned hair collapsing in wet ropes against her neck, reaching the door just as lightning split the sky directly overhead with a crack that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. She pushed the door open without thought, without courtesy, seeking only escape from the elemental fury that pursued her, and she stood gasping in the sudden shelter, water streaming from her clothes to pool on the worn wooden floor, before she raised her eyes and found herself staring at the tall, dark figure who stood before the crackling fire with an expression of such cold fury that she wondered if she might have been safer remaining in the storm. The Duke of Blackwood did not move from his position before the fire, but the temperature in the small lodge seemed to drop, despite the flames crackling in the hearth, and when he spoke his voice carried the quiet devastation of a blade being drawn from its sheath. You. The single word contained 20 years of hatred, and Eloise forced herself to meet those storm-grey eyes, even as every instinct screamed at her to flee back into the tempest that raged beyond the walls. For surely the lightning and wind posed less danger than the man who stood before her with murder in his gaze. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, given that her teeth wanted to chatter from cold and fear in equal measure. "I apologize for the intrusion, but the storm." "I am aware of the storm," he cut her off, each word precise as a surgeon's incision. "What I fail to comprehend is why, of all the structures on this estate, you chose to seek shelter in the one place where I had specifically retreated to escape the company of those I find objectionable." Eloise felt the barb strike true, felt the familiar burn of shame that accompanied every encounter with those who knew her father's name, but she had learned long ago that cowering only invited further attack, and so she straightened her spine despite the water dripping from her ruined hair and pooling in her sodden shoes. "I assure your Grace that had I known you were here, I would have taken my chances with the lightning," she replied, and something flickered in his expression, something that might have been surprise at finding teeth in a creature he had expected to grovel. The wind howled against the windows with renewed fury, and they both turned to watch as a tree branch, the size of a man's arm, struck the glass with enough force to make the panes rattle in their frames, and Eloise understood with sinking certainty that she would not be leaving this place until the storm exhausted itself, that she was trapped here with a man who had every reason to despise her very existence. Sebastian appeared to reach the same conclusion, for his jaw tightened and he turned away from her, presenting his broad back as though her presence offended him too greatly to warrant acknowledgement, and Eloise seized upon his dismissal as permission to claim the chair furthest from the fire, settling into its worn cushions and wrapping her damp shawl more tightly around shoulders that had begun to shake with cold. She asked for nothing, requested no comfort, made no plea for proximity to the warmth that was clearly his by right of prior occupation, and as the hours crawled past in bitter silence, broken only by the storm's fury, she felt his gaze return to her again and again, felt him watching her shiver and refuse to beg, and she wondered if he found satisfaction in her suffering, or if something else entirely lurked behind those winter eyes. The cold seeped deeper into Eloise's bones as the hours crawled past, her damp clothing offering no protection against the chill that seemed to radiate from the very stones of the hunting lodge, and she clenched her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering, unwilling to display any further weakness before the man who watched her from his position of warmth and power beside the crackling fire. She had survived worse than physical discomfort, had endured seasons without adequate coal and winters where frost formed on the inside of her bedroom windows, and she would not give the Duke of Blackwood the satisfaction of seeing her beg for proximity to the flames that were rightfully his by prior claim. But Sebastian, it seemed, had limits to his cruelty that she had not anticipated, for after what felt like an eternity of watching her shiver in stubborn silence, he moved abruptly toward the narrow cot in the corner of the room and seized the rough woolen blanket that lay folded there, crossing the space between them with long strides, and thrusting the fabric toward her with an expression that suggested the gesture cost him dearly. "Take it," he said curtly, "the words more command than offer, before you catch your death, and I am forced to explain to Lady Pemberton why I allowed a guest to expire of cold in my presence." Eloise accepted the blanket with hands that trembled, despite her efforts to steady them, wrapping its scratchy warmth around her shoulders and feeling the first blessed relief from the bone-deep chill that had settled into her very marrow. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, and she meant it genuinely, without artifice or the simpering gratitude that so many ladies employed when seeking favor from powerful men, and something in her simple sincerity seemed to catch him off guard, for he stood frozen for a moment before retreating to his position by the fire with what might have been confusion flickering across his stern features. "Do not mistake practical necessity for kindness," he said harshly, as though needing to reassure himself of his own coldness. "I simply have no desire to deal with the complications that would arise from your demise." Eloise made no reply, merely drawing the blanket closer and allowing herself to feel, for the first time since entering the lodge, something other than fear. "Your father," Sebastian continued, and his voice had taken on a different quality now, something almost conversational beneath the bitter edge, "would have demanded the fire itself, would have complained and threatened and made certain everyone knew of his suffering." Eloise met his gaze steadily across the firelit space. "I am not my father, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I cannot choose my blood, only my actions." The words seemed to strike him with unexpected force, and he turned away from her to stare into the flames as though they held answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. The night stretched ahead of them, endless hours until dawn might bring deliverance, and Eloise drew from her pocket the small volume she had taken from the library, a treatise on Stoic philosophy that had travelled with her from the main house, and she began to read by the flickering light while the storm raged beyond the walls. She did not notice how often his gaze returned to her face, did not see how he studied the peaceful concentration in her expression as she lost herself in ancient wisdom, did not witness the first small crack forming in the edifice of hatred he had constructed so carefully over 20 years of nursing his wounds. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, thick and oppressive despite the storm's continued assault upon the windows, and Sebastian found himself growing restless in a way that had nothing to do with physical discomfort and everything to do with the woman who sat reading by firelight as though she had not a care in the world beyond the pages before her. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps desperate attempts at seduction or manipulation, for he had learned long ago that women of the ton employed every weapon in their arsenal when trapped with a powerful man, and yet Eloise Ashworth simply read her book with an expression of serene concentration that made him feel, absurdly, as though he were the one intruding upon her solitude. "What are you reading?" The question emerged more harshly than he intended, torn from him by an irritation he could not quite name, and she looked up with those clear grey eyes that seemed to hold neither fear nor artifice, merely mild surprise at being addressed. "Marcus Aurelius," she replied, turning the small volume so he might see its worn cover. "His Meditations." Sebastian felt his eyebrows rise despite himself, for he had expected sentimental poetry or Gothic novels, the frivolous fare that occupied most ladies of his acquaintance, not the philosophical musings of a Roman emperor. "And what does a young lady find to interest her in Stoic philosophy?" he asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice, though something in him genuinely wished to know the answer. Eloise considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she seemed to bring to everything, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of genuine reflection rather than the desire to impress. "He writes of accepting what we cannot control while taking responsibility for what we can," she said quietly. "I find comfort in the reminder that our circumstances need not define our character, that we may choose who we become regardless of what fortune bestows or withholds." The words struck Sebastian with unexpected force, for they spoke directly to the philosophy he himself had adopted in rebuilding his family's shattered legacy, and he found himself drawn into debate despite every intention to maintain his cold distance. They discussed the nature of virtue and the limits of human will, the balance between acceptance and action, and with each exchange Sebastian discovered new depths to the woman he had dismissed as merely her father's daughter. She challenged his interpretations with keen intelligence, conceded points with grace when his arguments proved stronger, and laughed softly at her own errors in a way that transformed her solemn face into something approaching beauty. Near midnight, when the fire had burned low and the storm had gentled to a steady rain, Eloise spoke of her father for the first time, her voice carrying neither defense nor condemnation, but only a profound and weary sadness. "I was 7 when he died," she said, staring into the embers. "I remember a man who brought me sweets and called me his little bird, but I have learned since what he truly was, what he did to your family and others. I cannot excuse him, Your Grace. I can only mourn the father I thought I had and try to be something better than the legacy he left me." Sebastian listened to her quiet confession and felt something shift in his chest, some calcified certainty beginning to crack, for he had never considered that she too might be a victim of the man he had hated for 2 decades. The silence that followed her confession seemed to pulse with unspoken things, and Sebastian found himself caught in the strange suspension of a moment that demanded response, yet offered no clear path forward. For what did one say to the daughter of his enemy when she had just stripped away every comfortable assumption he had carried for 20 years? He turned from the fire to face her fully, and in the dim glow of the dying embers, he saw not the scheming offspring of a villain, but simply a young woman who had known her own measure of loss, and something in that recognition loosened the iron bands he had kept wrapped around his own memories for so very long. "My father was not always the broken man he became," Sebastian heard himself say, the words emerging as though someone else spoke them, rough with disuse and heavy with a grief he had never permitted himself to voice. "Before your father's betrayal, he was vital, ambitious, full of plans for our family's future, and I remember how he would lift me onto his shoulders so I might see the world from his height, how he promised me that one day all he built would be mine to steward and expand." He paused, his jaw tightening against the tide of memory that threatened to overwhelm the careful walls he had constructed. "After the scandal broke, after our name was dragged through every drawing room in London and our fortunes stripped away by creditors who had once called themselves friends, I watched him diminish day by day, watched the light leave his eyes until he was merely a shell inhabiting the chair by the window, waiting for death to claim what was left of him." Eloise listened without interruption, her grey eyes holding steady on his face with an attention that felt neither invasive nor pitying, but simply present, and Sebastian continued because stopping now seemed impossible, the dam having broken after so many years of enforced silence. "My mother followed him within the year," he said quietly. The physicians called it a fever, but I knew even at 15 that she had simply lost the will to remain in a world where everything she loved had been destroyed, and I stood at her graveside and swore that I would rebuild what had been taken, that I would restore our name and fortune until no one would ever again dare to whisper of Blackwood shame. He fell silent, staring into the embers, and when Eloise spoke, her voice was soft, with a compassion that held no trace of hollow comfort. "Children should not pay for their parents' wars," she said simply, and the words settled into the space between them like a benediction, acknowledging both their wounds without attempting to diminish either. The fire had burned dangerously low, and Sebastian moved without conscious thought to add wood from the stack beside the hearth, feeding the flames until warmth began to push back against the chill that had crept into the small lodge during their conversation. When he turned back, he found her eyes had grown heavy, the exhaustion of the storm-tossed night finally claiming its due despite her efforts to remain alert, and he watched as she struggled against sleep's pull before finally surrendering, her head tilting against the chair's worn back, her breathing evening into the gentle rhythm of peaceful slumber. He stood motionless for a long moment, observing the firelight dancing across features that looked younger in repose, softer somehow without the careful guard she maintained during waking hours. And before he could question the impulse, he had removed his own coat and crossed to where she slept, draping the warm fabric over her slight form with hands that trembled slightly at their own treachery. It was merely practical, he told himself firmly, nothing more than what any gentleman would do for a lady in need of warmth. And yet he could not explain why he remained standing there watching her sleep, could not account for the strange tenderness that bloomed in his chest where hatred had lived so comfortably for so many years, could not name the precise moment when the first dangerous crack appeared in the fortress of his resentment, admitting light where only darkness had dwelt before. Dawn crept through the hunting lodge's small windows with the tentative gold of a world washed clean, and Eloise woke slowly to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth where cold should have been, her sleep-fogged mind taking several long moments to register the heavy wool coat that covered her like a blanket and the faint masculine scent of sandalwood and cedar that clung to its fibers. Memory returned in a rush: the storm, the Duke, the extraordinary conversation that had stretched through the darkest hours, and she sat up abruptly, her heart pounding with sudden awareness of her circumstances and the catastrophic impropriety of having spent an entire night alone with an unmarried gentleman, even one who had begun the evening as her declared enemy. Sebastian stood at the window, his back to her, his tall frame silhouetted against the pale morning light, and she could see from the rigid set of his shoulders that he had slept little, if at all, that he had spent the remaining hours of darkness wrestling with thoughts she could not begin to imagine. He turned at the sound of her movement, and for one suspended moment their eyes met across the small room, and Eloise saw in his gaze a confusion that mirrored her own, a searching quality that suggested he too was trying to reconcile the man he had been yesterday with whatever he had become during the long night's passage. "The storm has passed," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else she could not name. "You must return to the main house before the other guests wake and discover your absence, or your reputation will be destroyed beyond any hope of recovery." She rose from the chair, acutely conscious of her disheveled appearance, her hair escaping its pins in wild tendrils, her dress creased and travel-worn, and she removed his coat with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts at composure, folding it carefully before holding it out to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, and the words carried weight far beyond gratitude for a simple garment, encompassing all that had passed between them in the darkness, the confidences exchanged, the walls that had crumbled stone by stone. "For your kindness." He took the coat, and in the transfer their fingers brushed, the briefest contact of skin against skin, and Eloise felt the touch travel through her like lightning, awakening something that had slumbered beneath years of resigned acceptance and careful hope. Sebastian's eyes darkened at the contact, his jaw tightening as though he too had felt the strange electricity of that moment. But he stepped back abruptly, his expression closing into the cool mask she had first encountered. "Use the servants' entrance at the east wing," he instructed gruffly. "All business now." The tender observer of the night hours vanished beneath the Duke's commanding authority. "The back stairs will take you to the guest corridor without passing through the main halls, and if you are quick, no one need know you were ever absent from your room." Eloise nodded, gathering her shawl and the small volume of Marcus Aurelius that had served as both shield and bridge during the night's strange journey, and she moved toward the door without looking back, knowing that to linger would be to invite questions neither of them was prepared to answer. She slipped through the morning bright grounds like a ghost, her heart racing with each step, and gained her chamber without incident, washing and changing with desperate haste before descending to breakfast with what she hoped was an expression of unremarkable calm. The other guests chatted and laughed, oblivious to the night's revelations, and when Sebastian entered the breakfast room some quarter-hour later, immaculately dressed and betraying no sign of sleeplessness, no one seemed to notice anything amiss. But Eloise noticed, and when his eyes found hers across the silver and crystal, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, a question, a promise she could not yet decipher, and she felt warmth bloom in her chest where fear had lived for so long, the first tender shoots of something that might, against all reason and expectation, grow into hope. The days that followed passed in a strange fever of awareness for Sebastian, each hour bringing fresh evidence that the careful categories of his mind had been irrevocably disordered by a single night's conversation and a pair of grey eyes that haunted him with their quiet dignity. He found himself watching her constantly, tracking her movements through the drawing rooms and gardens of Thornfield Manor with an attention he could neither explain nor suppress, noting how she held herself apart from the glittering company, not from arrogance, but from the resigned understanding that she was not truly welcome among them. He observed the small cruelties that society inflicted upon her with such practiced ease, the way ladies drew their skirts aside when she passed, as though poverty might be contagious, the manner in which invitations to join walking parties were extended only after she had already been excluded, the cutting remarks delivered just loudly enough for her to hear, but quietly enough to maintain plausible deniability. Through it all, Eloise bore herself with a grace that made something twist painfully in Sebastian's chest, her spine straight and her expression serene, even as he could see the faint tremor in her hands when she lifted her teacup, the momentary closing of her eyes, when another slight landed upon shoulders already burdened with years of such treatment. He watched her offer genuine kindness to the servants who attended the guests, thanking them by name when others looked through them as though they were merely part of the furnishings, and he saw how the elderly Lady Pemberton's face brightened when Eloise sat beside her, engaging the often ignored dowager in conversation that left the old woman laughing with a delight her own family rarely troubled to inspire. On the third day, Lord Whitmore, a man Sebastian had always found tedious but had never before actively despised, made a jest at dinner about the dangers of allowing certain bloodlines into decent company, his piggy eyes fixed on Eloise with malicious satisfaction as laughter rippled around the table. Sebastian watched her face pale, watched the brief flicker of devastation before her features smoothed into careful blankness, watched her set down her fork with steady hands and respond to some innocuous question from her neighbor, as though nothing had occurred, and he felt something protective surge through him with a force that left him momentarily breathless, an emotion so foreign to his experience that he had no name for it, only the certain knowledge that he would have crossed the table and struck Whitmore if doing so would not have caused Eloise greater distress through the scandal it would create. From that moment, Sebastian began positioning himself with strategic precision, placing his considerable social weight between Eloise and those who would wound her, steering conversations away from dangerous waters with a skill he had honed through years of political maneuvering, ensuring that when he stood near her, the lesser predators of society found their courage failing. He told himself this was merely justice, merely the correction of an error he had perpetuated by hating an innocent woman for her father's crimes, but late at night in the solitude of his chamber, he knew the truth was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more impossible to ignore. The final ball of Lady Pemberton's house party blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers and mirrored walls until the grand ballroom seemed to shimmer with captured starlight, and Eloise stood at its edge in her carefully mended gown of pale blue silk, watching the glittering company swirl through the figures of a country dance, while she told herself that she had survived the week, that in mere hours she would return to her quiet cottage and her mother's gentle company, and leave behind this world of sharp smiles and sharper tongues that had never truly been hers. She had not spoken privately with Sebastian since that morning in the hunting lodge, though she had felt his presence like a physical force throughout the remaining days, his dark gaze finding hers across crowded rooms with an intensity that made her breath catch and her heart race with emotions she dared not examine too closely. And she had begun to wonder if the connection she had felt during that extraordinary night had been nothing more than a product of the storm's strange intimacy, a fever dream that would fade with distance and time. The orchestra struck up a new melody, and Lord Whitmore's voice cut through the music with the practiced carrying power of a man accustomed to commanding attention, his florid face flushed with wine and malice as he declared to his circle of sycophants that it was really quite shameful that Ashworth's daughter had dared show her face in decent company, that some people had no sense of propriety whatsoever, that the sins of the father should rightfully descend upon the child when the father's sins were so very grievous. The room fell silent with the sudden hush of scandal anticipated, faces turning toward Eloise with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction to the avid hunger of those who fed upon others' humiliation, and she felt the blood drain from her face as shame burned through her like acid, her hands trembling at her sides as she fought the desperate urge to flee, to run from this glittering torture chamber and never return, knowing that to do so would only confirm everything they believed about her, that she was lesser, unworthy, forever tainted by a dead man's crimes. Then Sebastian stepped forward from the shadows where he had been watching, and his voice cut through the whispers like a blade of ice, cold and precise and devastating in its authority, as he declared that Lady Eloise Ashworth had shown more honor and dignity in 1 week than Lord Whitmore had demonstrated in his entire miserable existence, that she possessed a grace and intelligence that put the entire assembled company to shame, and that anyone who dared insult her in his presence would answer to him personally. Shock rippled through the ballroom in visible waves, mouths falling open, fans freezing mid-flutter, as the Duke of Blackwood, the man who had built his reputation upon his hatred of the Ashworth name, crossed the marble floor with purposeful strides and stopped before Eloise, with an expression that dared anyone to challenge him. He offered her his arm with formal courtesy, asked if she would do him the honor of this dance, and when her trembling fingers settled upon his sleeve, he led her onto the floor as the orchestra stumbled into a waltz, and all of society watched in stunned disbelief as the Duke of Blackwood held his enemy's daughter in his arms and looked at her as though she were the only person in the room. The waltz ended as all dreams must end, with the final strains of music fading into silence and the return of reality pressing in from all sides, and before Eloise could find words to express the tumult of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, Sebastian released her from his arms with a formal bow, his expression once again unreadable, and disappeared into the crowd of guests who parted before him like waves before the prow of a great ship. She stood alone on the dance floor for a moment that stretched into eternity, her heart racing and her mind struggling to comprehend what had just occurred, until Lady Pemberton appeared at her elbow with fluttering hands and nervous exclamations about what an unexpected honor, what a remarkable turn of events, and guided her to a chair where she might recover her composure while the other guests regarded her with expressions transformed from contempt to cautious reassessment. The remaining hours of the ball passed in a blur of faces and murmured courtesies, people who had ignored her for days now finding reasons to speak with her, to inquire after her mother's health, to express hope that they might call upon her when next in her neighborhood, and through it all Eloise smiled and responded with appropriate graciousness, while her thoughts remained fixed upon Sebastian's face as he had declared her worthy of respect, upon the warmth of his hand at her waist during their dance, upon the 1,000 questions that burned within her breast without hope of answers. She returned home to her mother 2 days later, the journey accomplished in a daze of confusion and fragile hope, and as she sat beside her mother's sickbed describing the events of the house party in carefully edited terms, she found herself unable to speak of Sebastian without her voice catching, without a warmth rising to her cheeks that her mother's sharp eyes did not fail to notice. Days stretched into weeks, with no word from Blackwood, no card, no letter, no indication that their extraordinary encounters had meant anything at all to him, and Eloise told herself firmly that she had been a fool to hope, that his defense of her had been merely the whim of a powerful man who could afford to indulge in unexpected gestures, that a duke did not truly concern himself with the fate of an impoverished earl's daughter, regardless of what had passed between them during one stormy night. Yet her heart whispered otherwise in the quiet hours before dawn, replaying every word he had spoken, every glance they had shared. The gentle weight of his coat settled over her sleeping form, and she could not silence the treacherous hope that flickered within her despite every rational argument against it. Meanwhile, in the imposing solitude of Blackwood Hall, Sebastian found himself consumed by thoughts of a grey-eyed woman who had somehow dismantled every certainty upon which he had built his life, and he had set his solicitors to discreet inquiries that revealed the full extent of her circumstances, the crumbling cottage, the mounting debts, the ailing mother whose care consumed what little resources remained, the dignity with which she faced a future that promised nothing but continued hardship, and the slow erosion of genteel poverty. Each piece of information deepened his respect into something far more dangerous, something that kept him awake through long nights as he wrestled with the terrifying possibility that hatred had transformed into its opposite, and that the daughter of his enemy had become the one person in all the world he could not bear to see suffer. 3 weeks had passed since the ball, 3 weeks of silence that had stretched Eloise's nerves to breaking and taught her the particular cruelty of hope, when the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive brought her to the window of their modest parlour, and her heart ceased its steady rhythm at the sight of the Blackwood crest upon the door of the elegant vehicle that had no business stopping before their shabby cottage with its peeling paint and overgrown garden. She had no time to prepare, no time to change from her simple mourning dress or arrange her hair more becomingly, for the Duke of Blackwood was already striding up the path with the purposeful gait of a man who had never in his life been made to wait, and she could only press her hands to her flushed cheeks and pray for composure as the maid announced him with wide, astonished eyes. He filled their small parlour with his presence, his dark greatcoat and impeccable tailoring a stark contrast to the faded upholstery and threadbare carpet, and Eloise was painfully aware of every shabby detail that marked their reduced circumstances, the carefully mended curtains, the empty spaces on the walls where paintings had been sold, the chill in the air because they could not afford fires in every room. Her mother was too ill to receive visitors, confined to her bed these past several days with the wasting sickness that stole a little more of her strength with each passing week, and so Eloise faced him alone, her chin raised despite her racing heart, determined to meet whatever cutting remarks or cold dismissals he had come to deliver with the same dignity she had shown him in the storm. But Sebastian did not deliver cutting remarks, did not survey their poverty with the contempt she had braced herself to endure. Instead, he stood before the cold fireplace, with his hands clasped behind his back and his winter-grey eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. And when he spoke, his voice held none of the icy disdain she remembered from their first encounters. He had come, he said, with a proposal, and he laid it before her with the same directness he might have used in a business negotiation. She needed security for herself and her mother. He required a duchess of intelligence and dignity who would not bore him with simpering foolishness, and he believed they might suit admirably for such an arrangement. Eloise stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend words that seemed to belong to some fever dream rather than the cramped reality of her mother's parlour, and she heard herself ask, why? Why would he marry his enemy's daughter? Why would he bind himself to the name he had despised for 20 years? Sebastian was silent for a long moment, and when he answered, something flickered behind the careful control of his expression. He told her that he no longer saw her father when he looked at her, that he saw only Eloise, only the woman who had faced his hatred with quiet courage and taught him that judgment based on blood alone was the refuge of weak minds. She asked for time to consider, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, and he granted it with a brief nod, his eyes searching her face as though memorizing its every feature, before he turned and left her standing, amid the shabby gentility of her former life, wondering if she had the courage to reach for a future she had never dared to imagine. Eloise climbed the narrow stairs to her mother's bedchamber, with legs that trembled beneath her, and a heart that had not ceased its frantic rhythm since Sebastian's carriage had disappeared down the lane, and she found Lady Ashworth propped against her pillows in the weak afternoon light, her once beautiful face gaunt with illness, but her eyes still sharp with the intelligence that no fever could diminish. She sat upon the edge of the bed and took her mother's thin hand in her own, and the words spilled forth in a tumult she could not contain. The Duke of Blackwood had come. The Duke of Blackwood had proposed marriage. The Duke of Blackwood wished to make her his duchess, and she did not know what to think or feel or believe, because surely such things did not happen to girls like her, to daughters of ruined men, to women who had resigned themselves to lives of quiet struggle and diminished hopes. Her mother listened without interruption, her frail fingers tightening around Eloise's with surprising strength, and when the flood of words finally ceased, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching her daughter's face with the penetrating wisdom that only mothers possess. The question she asked was not about wealth or title or the restoration of their fortunes, not about society's reaction or the practicalities of such an unequal match. She asked simply, quietly, whether Sebastian was kind. The question struck Eloise like a blow, cutting through all the confusion and fear and desperate hope to the heart of what truly mattered, and she found herself remembering not his cold reputation or his fearsome power, but the weight of his coat settling over her shoulders as she slept, the wood he had added to the fire without being asked, the fury in his voice as he defended her honor before all society, the way his eyes had softened almost imperceptibly when he spoke of no longer seeing her father when he looked at her. She admitted to her mother that she believed he could be kind, that she had glimpsed something beneath the ice that spoke of a heart capable of warmth if only it were allowed to thaw, and her mother smiled the gentle smile of a woman who had known both great love and great sorrow, and understood that the two were often intertwined. Respect, her mother counseled in a voice grown weak with illness, but firm with conviction, was a foundation upon which all lasting happiness must be built, and love, true love, could grow from such soil if tended with patience and courage. Eloise remained at her mother's bedside long after Lady Ashworth had drifted into exhausted sleep, turning over the words in her mind, examining her own heart with ruthless honesty, and when she finally rose to pen her response to Sebastian's proposal, she did so not from the desperation of a woman seeking rescue from poverty, but from the tentative hope of a woman who dared to believe that she might find something far more precious than security. The letter she wrote was brief, her acceptance plainly stated, and when Sebastian's response arrived the following day, equally brief, formally worded, containing nothing of sentiment or flowery declaration, she read it 3 times over, her fingers tracing the bold strokes of his handwriting, and imagined she could detect beneath the careful formality something that might have been relief, something that might have been anticipation, something that made her heart lift with the fragile, terrifying wings of hope taking flight. The wedding was held on a grey November morning in the small village church near Blackwood Hall, a modest ceremony that would have been unremarkable were it not for the identity of the groom, and the whispers that preceded them down the aisle spoke of scandal and speculation and the inexplicable mystery of why the Duke of Blackwood would bind himself to the daughter of his greatest enemy. Eloise wore her mother's wedding dress, ivory silk yellowed slightly with age but still beautiful, altered by her own careful hands to fit her slimmer frame, and as she stood before the mirror in the cramped room where she had prepared, she thought of her mother wearing this same gown 30 years before, radiant with hope and love for a man who would eventually bring ruin upon them all. But she would not think of her father today, would not allow his shadow to darken this threshold she was about to cross. Instead, she touched the delicate lace at her throat and drew a steadying breath, and when the church doors opened before her, she walked forward with her chin raised and her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom or flight. Sebastian stood at the altar in severe black, his dark hair swept back from his angular face, and his expression as she approached was utterly unreadable, a mask of aristocratic composure that revealed nothing of what thoughts moved behind those winter-grey eyes. But when she reached him and placed her trembling hand in his, she felt the steadiness of his grip, the warmth of his fingers closing around hers with a firmness that seemed almost protective, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, just enough to allow her to breathe. The vows were spoken in voices that echoed through the near-empty church, her mother present despite her illness, supported by a hired nurse, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. Sebastian's solicitor standing as witness, the elderly vicar, who had known Eloise since childhood, pronouncing words that would bind her forever to a man she barely knew and yet somehow trusted. When Sebastian slid the ring onto her finger, a band of gold set with a sapphire that matched her eyes, chosen with more care than a purely practical arrangement would warrant, she looked up and found him watching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. The wedding breakfast was small, held in a private room at the local inn, and Eloise sat beside her new husband in a daze of unreality, accepting his quiet courtesies, watching her mother smile through her tears with a joy that seemed to transcend her failing body. When it came time to depart for Blackwood Hall, Sebastian helped her into the ducal carriage with a gentleness that surprised her still, his hand lingering at her elbow a moment longer than strictly necessary, and as the wheels began to turn and her old life fell away behind them, she sat in the plush silence beside him and wondered what awaited her in the halls of the man who had once despised her very name. He did not speak during the journey, but neither did his silence feel hostile. It was instead a contemplative, quiet, and when she stole a glance at his profile against the window's grey light, she thought she saw something almost vulnerable in the set of his jaw. Their new life stretched before them, uncertain and untested, a path forged from the ashes of old hatred toward a destination neither could yet name, and Eloise folded her hands in her lap and allowed herself, for the first time, to hope that this strange beginning might lead somewhere beautiful. The early weeks of marriage unfolded, with the careful choreography of two people learning to share a life while still uncertain of the steps, and Eloise found herself navigating the vast halls of Blackwood Hall with a mixture of wonder and wariness that she could not quite shake. They maintained separate bedchambers as befitted a marriage of convenience, his door at the far end of the corridor from hers, and yet she was acutely aware of his presence in every room she entered, as though the very walls had absorbed something of his essence during all those years he had lived here alone. Their meals together began in stilted formality, polite inquiries about her comfort, equally polite assurances that she wanted for nothing, but gradually, imperceptibly, the conversations deepened, touching first upon the management of the estate and then upon books they had read and opinions they held, and Eloise discovered that Sebastian possessed a dry wit that emerged only when he forgot to guard himself, a fleeting warmth that vanished the moment he seemed to realize it had appeared. He took her on tours of the property, walking beside her through gardens that had grown wild during his years of single-minded focus on rebuilding the family fortune. And his voice softened when he spoke of his plans to restore them, of the roses his mother had once tended, of the fountain that had not flowed since his childhood. Eloise listened and understood that he was showing her not merely grounds and outbuildings, but pieces of himself, fragments of the boy he had been. Before grief and betrayal had forged him into this formidable man, in return, she began to leave her own mark upon the cold magnificence of Blackwood Hall, fresh flowers appearing in vases that had stood empty for years, curtains drawn back to admit light that had been shut out, laughter echoing in the servants' quarters where the staff had grown accustomed to oppressive silence. She learned the names of every maid and footman, inquired after their families, remembered their troubles and small joys, and the household began to transform around her like a frozen garden touched by unexpected spring. Sebastian noticed everything, though he said little. She would catch him pausing in doorways to observe her arranging blooms or kneeling to speak with a nervous housemaid, and the expression on his face, in those unguarded moments, was one she could not decipher, something between confusion and wonder, and a hunger he seemed determined to suppress. He began finding excuses to seek her company, questions about household matters that surely did not require his attention, suggestions that she might enjoy seeing the library's rarest volumes, invitations to walk the grounds when the weather proved fair, and Eloise accepted each one with a pleasure she tried to conceal, her heart quickening whenever his tall form appeared in whatever room she occupied. The distance between them shrank by degrees so subtle she could not have marked the moment when courtesy became something warmer, when his hand at her elbow began to linger, when she started listening for his footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. Their fingers would brush when he handed her a book or helped her over uneven ground, and each accidental touch sent warmth flooding through her veins, a warmth she saw reflected in the flicker of his grey eyes before he looked away, and she knew with growing certainty that whatever this marriage had been at its beginning, it was becoming something neither of them had dared to name. The library had become their sanctuary, the place where the careful formality of their days softened into something approaching intimacy, and it was there on an evening when winter rain streaked the tall windows and the fire crackled in its marble hearth that Eloise finally summoned the courage to ask the question that had haunted her since the morning she had accepted his proposal. They sat in their customary positions, she upon the settee, with a volume of poetry open in her lap, he in the leather chair, across from her with papers he had long since ceased to review, and the silence between them had grown heavy, with all the things neither dared to speak, until she heard her own voice breaking it, quiet but steady. "Do you regret it? Your choice to marry me?" Sebastian's hands stilled upon the papers he had been pretending to read, and for a long moment he did not look at her, his profile illuminated by firelight in a way that revealed the tension in his jaw, the careful control he exercised over every aspect of himself. Then he set aside the documents with deliberate care, and when he finally turned to face her, his grey eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I find myself," he began, and then stopped, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, as though he required something solid to anchor him. "I find that I must tell you something, though I confess I have never been adept at speaking of such matters." The silence stretched between them, and Eloise waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, uncertain whether she hoped for confession or dreaded it. "When I proposed to you," Sebastian continued, his voice low and rough-edged in a way she had never heard, "I told myself it was practical, that you needed security, and I needed a duchess who would not simper or scheme, and I believed that explanation because the alternative was—" He broke off, shaking his head, and rose from his chair with the restless energy of a man who could no longer contain himself within stillness. He crossed to the window, staring out at the rain-lashed darkness, and when he spoke again his voice was barely above a whisper. "That night in the hunting lodge, when you sat reading by firelight as though being trapped with a man who despised you was merely an inconvenience to be weathered with grace, something broke apart inside me that I had not known was capable of breaking. I watched you sleep beneath my coat, and I understood that everything I had believed about hatred and inheritance and the immutable nature of enmity was a lie I had told myself, because the truth was too terrifying to contemplate." He turned from the window then, and the vulnerability in his face, the raw, unguarded emotion that stripped away every layer of aristocratic reserve, stole the breath from Eloise's lungs. "I did not marry you for practicality, Eloise. I married you because from that night forward I could think of nothing else, no one else, because you showed me what courage and kindness truly look like, and I wanted—" His voice broke, and he crossed to where she sat, dropping to his knees before her with a gracelessness that spoke of desperation rather than design. "I love you," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep and wounded. "I love you, and I have loved you since that storm, and I have been too much a coward to speak it. Too afraid that you could never feel anything but tolerance for a man who once regarded you with such undeserved contempt. But I cannot bear another night of pretending that this marriage is merely an arrangement of convenience, when every moment in your presence is both the greatest joy I have ever known and an exquisite agony of wanting what I dared not name." The tears that had been gathering in Eloise's eyes spilled over at last, tracing silver paths down her cheeks as she looked upon this man who knelt before her with his heart laid bare, this proud and powerful duke who had stripped away every defense to offer her the truth she had scarcely dared to dream might exist. "Sebastian," she whispered, and his name upon her lips felt like a prayer, like a key turning in a lock that had held her heart prisoner for longer than she could remember. "I have been so afraid, afraid to hope, afraid to want, afraid that if I allowed myself to feel what has been growing inside me since that night in the storm, I would only be preparing myself for a devastation from which I could never recover." She reached out with trembling fingers to touch his face, to trace the strong line of his jaw and feel the slight roughness where his evening beard was beginning to shadow his skin, and the way his eyes fluttered closed at her touch, the way he leaned into her palm as though her hand were the only thing anchoring him to the earth, undid something that had been wound tight within her chest for years upon years. "Every kindness you showed me," she continued, her voice breaking over the words, "every small gesture, every moment when you looked at me as though I were something precious rather than something shameful. Each one dismantled another piece of the wall I had built around myself, and I told myself I was foolish, that I was reading meaning where none existed, that a man like you could never truly want a woman like me, burdened as I am with my father's legacy and my own insufficiencies." Sebastian's hands came up to cover hers, where it rested against his cheek, and when he opened his eyes they were bright, with an emotion that stole her breath, an intensity of feeling that she recognized because it mirrored what blazed within her own breast. "You are not burdened," he said fiercely. "You are not insufficient. You are the finest person I have ever known, and I have been a fool and a coward for every day I failed to tell you so." And then she was saying the words she had held captive for so long, the confession pouring from her lips like water released from a dam. I love you, Sebastian. I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become, and I think perhaps I have loved you since you draped your coat over me while I slept and thought I would not know. The sound he made then was half laugh, half sob, and he rose from his knees only to draw her up with him, his hands cradling her face as though she was something infinitely precious. And when his lips met hers at last, it was with a tenderness that spoke of reverence, of wonder, of promises made in the silent language of touch. The kiss deepened, transformed, became something urgent and necessary as breath itself, and Eloise found herself clinging to him as sensation overwhelmed thought, as the careful propriety they had maintained for weeks burned away in the fire that had been kindling between them since that storm-racked night. When he lifted her into his arms, she did not protest, only pressed her face into the curve of his neck and breathed in the scent of him, sandalwood and wood smoke, and something essentially Sebastian. As he carried her from the library, through corridors that blurred past unnoticed, to the chamber that would from this night forward be theirs together. What passed between them in the candlelit darkness was everything their slow and careful courtship had promised it would be, a union of bodies that was also a union of souls, tender and passionate by turns, marked by whispered words of love and discovery, and the profound joy of two people who had found in each other the home they had despaired of ever knowing. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with her head upon his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, they spoke of the future they would build together, of children and laughter, and a love that would only deepen with time. And Eloise understood at last that every sorrow she had endured, every humiliation and lonely night, had been leading her inexorably to this moment, to this man, to this happiness she had never believed could be hers. The London season that year would be remembered not for the scandals that usually set tongues wagging, nor for the fashions that graced Almack's hallowed halls, but for the extraordinary transformation of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood, who arrived in town as a couple so visibly, so radiantly in love, that even the most cynical observers found themselves forced to abandon their assumptions about marriages of convenience and cold aristocratic arrangements. Eloise moved through the glittering ballrooms and elegant drawing-rooms on Sebastian's arm, and those who had known her as the shamed daughter of a disgraced earl could scarcely reconcile their memories with the woman who now stood before them, not merely a duchess in title, but a duchess in bearing, her quiet dignity transformed into confident grace, her beauty no longer dimmed by worry and want, but illuminated by happiness that seemed to glow from within. The faded dresses of her impoverished years had given way to gowns of exquisite taste, commissioned by a husband who took evident pleasure in seeing her adorned as she deserved. Yet it was not the silk and jewels that drew every eye when she entered a room, but rather the way Sebastian looked at her, the way his hand found the small of her back with unconscious possessiveness, the way his severe features softened into something approaching tenderness whenever their gazes met across a crowded space. Lord Whitmore, that same gentleman who had once loudly declared it shameful for an Ashworth to show her face in decent company, now bowed deeply when they encountered each other at Lady Jersey's ball, his face a mask of forced courtesy that could not quite conceal the discomfort beneath, and Eloise received his greeting with the same serene dignity she had once employed to survive his cruelty, though now that dignity was armored by the knowledge that she stood higher than he could ever hope to reach. Sebastian watched the exchange with cold satisfaction, and when Whitmore retreated, he murmured against her ear that the man looked as though he had swallowed something particularly unpleasant, drawing from her a laugh that turned heads throughout the room. They learned through the efficient machinery of society gossip that Lord Whitmore's own marriage, contracted for wealth and connection rather than affection, had become a source of barely concealed misery. His wife, the heiress whose fortune he had coveted, treated him with open disdain, and their household was rumoured to be a battleground of bitter silences and separate lives. The vindication was sweet, Eloise could not deny it, yet as she stood beside Sebastian watching Whitmore's pinched expression as his wife publicly contradicted him, she found that revenge mattered far less than she had once imagined it might. For what was the satisfaction of seeing her tormentor, humbled, compared to the joy of Sebastian's fingers intertwined with hers, of his proud gaze, when she charmed a duchess, or made a clever observation that drew appreciative laughter from their companions? Her mother, now installed in comfortable rooms at Blackwood Hall with servants to attend her every need and the finest physicians money could procure, had wept when she saw Eloise descend the staircase on the Duke's arm before their first London engagement, and though the older woman remained too frail to make the journey to town, her letters arrived weekly, filled with wonder at how completely their fortunes had reversed, how thoroughly happiness had replaced the despair that had once seemed their permanent condition. Society, that fickle arbiter of worth and acceptability, had rendered its verdict. The Duke of Blackwood had chosen well, and his Duchess was a credit to his ancient name, and if their union had begun in the ashes of old hatred, it had blossomed into something that even the most romantic debutante might envy. 5 years had passed since that storm-racked night when two wounded souls had found shelter together, and Blackwood Hall had transformed from a monument to grief and bitter determination into something it had never been in all its centuries of existence. A home filled with joy. The sound of children's laughter echoed through corridors that had once known only silence and sorrow, and Eloise stood at the edge of the south garden on a golden autumn afternoon, one hand resting upon the swell of her belly where their third child grew, watching as Sebastian led their son's pony in patient circles across the lawn, while 4-year-old Edward shrieked with delight and demanded to go faster. Their daughter, Charlotte, just 2 years old and already possessed of her father's stubborn determination, sat on a blanket nearby with her grandmother, the former Lady Ashworth now restored to health and happiness, and the old woman caught Eloise's eye with a smile that spoke of wonder at how completely their lives had changed. Sebastian glanced up then, as though he felt the weight of Eloise's gaze upon him, and the smile that transformed his features was the one he reserved only for her, the one that still, after 5 years of marriage, had the power to steal her breath and fill her heart to overflowing. She thought of the man he had been when first they met, cold, armored in hatred, determined to despise her for sins she had never committed, and marveled at the journey that had brought them from that place of enmity to this garden where their children played and their love grew stronger with each passing season. The storm that had once seemed a curse had proven to be the strangest of blessings, forcing two people who should have been enemies to see each other clearly, to recognize the wounds they shared and the healing they might offer one another. Her father's betrayal, which had shadowed her entire existence with shame and limitation, had led her by paths she could never have anticipated to this man, this life, this happiness she had once believed forever beyond her reach. That evening, after the children had been tucked into their beds with stories and kisses, after the house had settled into the peaceful quiet of nightfall, Eloise lay in Sebastian's arms, in the chamber they had shared since that first night of confession and union, and she whispered against his chest the gratitude that still overwhelmed her when she contemplated the fullness of her life. "You are my redemption," he murmured in return, his hand stroking gently over her hair. "You showed me that the past does not have to poison the future, that hatred can transform into something far more powerful, and I thank God every day for that storm that brought you to my door." They had built something beautiful from the ashes of old wounds, proof that love, when it is patient and true, can conquer even the deepest divides and heal the most grievous injuries. And so, dear reader, if you have journeyed with us through this tale of enmity transformed to devotion, of two hearts that found in each other the home they had despaired of knowing, may you carry with you the hope that such love exists for all who are brave enough to reach for it, that the sins of the past need not determine the blessings of the future, and that sometimes the greatest joys arrive disguised as our greatest trials.